Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about cell division and reproduction. This section has four major ideas. The first one is why cell division and reproduction needs to happen in the first place. After that, we'll talk about specifically how eukaryotic cells go through two different types of division, mitosis and meiosis, and why each of these are important. And finally, we'll talk about what happens when either mitosis or meiosis goes wrong. First, we'll start with basic cell division. When we talk about cell division, we're thinking about how cells reproduce one another. This is the heart of all reproduction across all organisms and is the basis of cell theory, the idea that cells originate only from pre-existing cells. Now, when we think about cell division, we often think about reproduction only, but that isn't the only thing that we use cell division for. For example, we also use cell division to heal. Cells have to reproduce themselves when they're part of a multicellular organism to allow them to replace damaged tissue. So when you get cut or a starfish loses its arm, it needs to use cell division to replace the part that's missing. In addition to that, organisms change over time. You weren't always the person you are today, were you? Of course not. You started out as a single cell, a fertilized egg, and then 2 cells, and then 4 cells, and then 8 cells. Sometimes cell division is important for growth and development, rather than reproduction itself. Now, there are 2 types of cell division. The first one is asexual reproduction. This happens when a cell produces an identical daughter cell. The other option is that a cell can reproduce sexually. This is important for producing cells that are different from the original. For example, if we were to think about a family like the one in this picture, we'd notice that these people are pretty different from one another. They have different skin colors, they have different hair, they have different eye colors, they're different heights. This variation comes from sexual reproduction and relies on the idea that the cells produced this way are unique. We'll spend some time talking about sexual reproduction later when we get to meiosis, but for now, let's focus on asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction happens in a variety of ways, but right now we're going to focus on the simplest ways that this can happen. The first is very popular for bacteria. This process is called binary fission. Essentially, what's going to happen is that the cell will grow until it gets large. We talked about how cells have a limit to how large they can be. At that point, the cell needs to divide before it will cross that limit. The cell will replicate its DNA, which in this case is in a nucleoid, because it's bacteria. Then, the cell wall in the plasma membrane will constrict in the middle of the cell. This is an EM picture of that happening. You can see that there is an indent in the dark red areas, which are part of the cell wall, as well as in the plasma membrane. Eventually, this constriction will reach all the way through the cell, separating the 2 copies of DNA. When this happens, the cells will then separate. And we're done. 2 identical cells. If we were to look at the entire bacteria while it's going through this process, we can see that the nucleoid was divided into 2 parts. That's the gray area here. Bacteria aren't particularly picky about how much of their DNA gets in either cell. As long as there's at least 1 copy of their circular chromosome, that's enough. The other option for prokaryotic cells, and some rare eukaryotes, is budding. Budding is pretty similar at the beginning. The nucleoid is going to replicate, so the DNA gets copied. But instead of dividing down the center and creating 2 equally sized cells, the cell pushes out a piece of its membrane to create a bud and pushes the nucleoid into that bud. Eventually, when the bud is large enough, the cell will then constrict and it will become 2 separate cells, the larger parent cell and the smaller identical daughter cell. Now, I mentioned that eukaryotic cells sometimes do this too. Particularly, that's common for yeast. It works the same way, except for the yeast cell is going to replicate its nucleus near where the bud is formed. Same idea though. Now, the process of cell division that we've talked about so far is the very basic, most easy level of thinking about it. The cell gets big, replicates its DNA, and cuts itself in half in one way or another.